In the years following the Second World War, Australia entered a new phase of national self-definition. The country presented itself as modern, democratic, and forward-looking. Internationally, the language of human rights, equality, and post-war reconstruction was gaining influence. But beneath this shift in rhetoric, the removal of Indigenous children not only continued, it expanded. By the late 1940s, Australian governments began to distance themselves from openly racial language. Policies that once described Indigenous people as inferior or incapable were now framed in more neutral terms. The word assimilation replaced older concepts of segregation and protection. On the surface, assimilation appeared progressive. Officials claimed Indigenous people would be helped to live like other Australians, sharing the same housing, education, and opportunities. But this vision was built on a single assumption, that Indigenous culture itself was the problem. Assimilation did not recognize Indigenous identity as something to coexist with. It treated it as something to dissolve. Children were central to this strategy. Government officials openly argued that Indigenous adults were already too culturally formed to change. Children, however, were described as adaptable. The younger they were removed, the more effective assimilation would be. This logic was repeated across welfare reports, parliamentary debates, and administrative guidelines. By the 1950s, these ideas were implemented nationwide across Australia. State welfare departments expanded their authority using child welfare legislation that appeared race-neutral on paper. In practice, Indigenous families were disproportionately targeted. Conditions of poverty, overcrowding, and instability, produced by decades of land dispossession and restricted employment, were redefined as neglect. This shift was crucial. Removal no longer required explicit racial justification. It could be presented as routine welfare intervention. Children were taken from homes deemed unsuitable, from hospitals shortly after birth, from schools during inspections, from mothers judged too young, too poor, or too isolated to parent properly. Often, removals happened without warning. Parents were given little explanation and no realistic avenue of appeal. Once a child entered the welfare system, reunification became increasingly unlikely. Institutions also evolved during this period. Large missions and reserves were gradually supplemented, and sometimes replaced, by foster care placements and group homes. Officials argued this represented a more humane, family-like environment. In reality, it fragmented Indigenous children further. Placed with non-Indigenous families, children were expected to abandon language, memory, and connection. Contact with biological family was discouraged or actively prevented. Identity was reshaped quietly, without the visibility of earlier institutions. Assimilation required that Indigenous children disappear into the population. Welfare files from the period reveal a disturbing pattern. Officers describe children as settling in, presenting well, or improving after removal. Emotional distress was reframed as adjustment. Grief was interpreted as resistance. Rarely did reports acknowledge the trauma of separation. By the early 1960s, removal had become an ordinary function of the welfare state. Many non-Indigenous Australians believed these practices were compassionate. Few understood their scale. Fewer still heard Indigenous voices describing the consequences. At the same time, Indigenous activism was intensifying. Families demanded the return of children. Community leaders challenged the moral authority of assimilation. Organizations began documenting removals and exposing their impact. These challenges were often dismissed as emotional, unscientific, or politically inconvenient. The state continued to insist it was acting in the best interests of the child. But beneath the softened language, the outcome remained unchanged. Children were removed. Families were broken. Culture was treated as a liability. Assimilation did not end the stolen generations. It made them harder to see. By the middle of the 20th century, the removal of Indigenous children had become embedded within everyday welfare practice. What once required special justification was now treated as routine. Across Australia, child welfare departments expanded rapidly during the 1950s and 1960s. Social workers, nurses, teachers, and police became the frontline agents of assimilation. Removal no longer looked like a dramatic intervention. It looked administrative. Hospitals played a critical role. Indigenous mothers giving birth were often assessed immediately by welfare officers. Judgments were made quickly, sometimes within hours, about a woman's capacity to parent. Poverty, lack of housing, or absence of a male partner were frequently cited as grounds for intervention. In some cases, mothers were told their babies had died. In others, they were pressured to sign documents they did not fully understand. Consent, when recorded, was often extracted under duress. Schools also became sites of surveillance. Teachers reported children who arrived hungry, poorly clothed, or tired. These observations were forwarded to welfare departments, triggering investigations. Structural inequality was reframed as individual failure. Once a child entered the system, decisions moved swiftly and largely without transparency. Court oversight was minimal. Indigenous parents were rarely represented. Hearings were brief. Outcomes were almost always predetermined. Removal orders were issued with little consideration for long-term harm. During this period, foster care placements increased significantly. Officials argued that placing Indigenous children in non-Indigenous households would accelerate assimilation. These placements were often described as successful when children appeared compliant or detached from their origins. Success was measured by silence. Children were encouraged, and sometimes required, to deny their Indigenous identity. Questions about family were discouraged. Cultural memory was treated as a problem to be managed. Many children grew up believing their separation was deserved. The psychological cost was immense. Children learned to adapt by suppressing emotion. Attachment became dangerous. Trust was provisional. Love could be withdrawn at any moment. For parents, the experience was devastating and ongoing. Mothers searched for children across years and jurisdictions. Letters went unanswered. Files were sealed. Information was withheld. Many families were left in permanent uncertainty, not knowing where their children were, whether they were safe, or if they would ever return. Public awareness remained limited. Mainstream media largely accepted the welfare narrative. Removal was portrayed as rescue. Indigenous voices were marginalized or ignored. Yet by the 1960s, resistance was becoming more visible. Indigenous activists challenged the legitimacy of child welfare practices. Community organizations documented cases of removal and began to connect personal stories into a broader pattern of systemic abuse. International pressure also mounted. Australia's image as a modern democracy sat uneasily alongside reports of racialized child removal. The language of assimilation began to fracture under scrutiny. Still, the system persisted. By the late 1960s, thousands of Indigenous children had been removed under welfare legislation that claimed neutrality while producing profoundly unequal outcomes. The machinery operated smoothly because it was familiar, procedural, and largely unquestioned. Removal had become normal. And what is normalized is rarely seen as violent, even when its consequences last a lifetime. If you believe this history deserves careful attention and space, staying with the series helps ensure these stories continue to be heard. By the mid-1960s, the system of child removal had reached a turning point. It had not slowed, but it had begun to attract scrutiny. For decades, the voices of Indigenous families had been excluded from public discussion. Their experiences were confined to sealed files, private grief, and community memory. But as Australia changed socially and politically, that silence became harder to maintain. Across Australia, Indigenous activism entered a new phase. Campaigns for civil rights, equal wages, and legal recognition gained visibility. Child removal, once framed as welfare, began to be described for what it was: forced separation. Families spoke publicly about children taken without consent. Adults who had grown up in institutions began to describe what life inside the system had been like: the discipline, the isolation, the erasure of identity. These testimonies challenged the official narrative. By the late 1960s, journalists and researchers started to document patterns that could no longer be dismissed as isolated cases. Reports revealed that Indigenous children were removed at vastly higher rates than non-Indigenous children, often for reasons that would never justify removal elsewhere. The claim of neutrality collapsed under evidence. At the same time, international attention intensified. Australia was increasingly judged against emerging global standards on human rights. The contradiction between democratic values and racialized child welfare practices became impossible to ignore. The 1967 referendum, while not directly addressing child removal, marked a symbolic shift. It signaled public willingness to reconsider the treatment of Indigenous people and acknowledge federal responsibility in Indigenous affairs. For many families affected by removal, it represented recognition long denied. Yet policy did not change overnight. Assimilation remained official doctrine. Welfare departments continued to remove children. Files continued to be sealed. But the legitimacy of the system was weakening. Within government, some officials acknowledged that removal had caused long-term harm. Reports began to reference emotional damage, identity loss, and family breakdown. These acknowledgments were cautious and often buried in technical language, but they existed. For those who had lived through removal, the consequences were already embedded. Many adults struggled with relationships, parenting, and belonging. Disconnection from culture was not a temporary condition. It shaped entire lives. Families attempted reunification under impossible circumstances. Children returned as adults to communities they barely remembered. Parents met sons and daughters they had not seen for decades. Reconnection was painful, incomplete, and often unsupported. The harm did not end when removal stopped. By the early 1970s, Australia stood at a crossroads. The idea that Indigenous children should be separated for their own good was increasingly challenged. Assimilation was losing moral authority. But its legacy remained entrenched, in records, in families, and in generations shaped by absence. What had once been described as protection was now being re-examined as trauma. The system had relied on silence to survive. When that silence began to break, the foundations weakened. The stolen generations were no longer invisible. They were becoming undeniable.